Hey, welcome to Multiplying and Dividing Real Numbers. Last class we learned about how to add and subtract. And there was a little point where I touched on multiplying and dividing, and I went, well, I kind of know that you have a little bit of extra knowledge, but now we're going to actually formally go over it. Okay, so, same thing as last class. When you think of negative, I want you to think of opposite. Right? Opposite is the most important word, and if you can remember that a negative is an opposite, it'll help you get through a lot of what we're doing today. When multiplying and dividing reals, the most important thing to keep in mind is how many negative signs there are. So if it's a positive times a positive, there's no opposites. You're going to end up with a positive sign. If there's a negative times a negative, you're going to go one way, you're going to turn around and come back the other. The negatives are going to cancel each other out. So you're going to end up with a positive also. Okay? If you have a positive and a negative, whether it's positive negative or negative positive, I don't really care how it comes out, but if you only have one negative, one opposite, your sign is going to be negative. Another way of saying this is that if you have the same sign, you're going to end up with a positive, and if you have the opposite sign, you're going to end up with a negative. Okay? Now recall one thing. You can never, ever, ever divide by zero. Right? Division is breaking something into equally many parts. I could break something into 2 parts. I could break something into 10 parts, right? I could even break 0 into equally many parts, right? If I have 0 pieces of pizza and 10 friends to give them to, I can split that 0 up evenly so they all have the same amount of pizza. They're all going to have 0, right? You can have 0 in the numerator, but you can never, ever, ever, ever have 0 in the denominator, have 0 in the bottom. You cannot divide by 0. You can't break something into 0 groups. If you do have a fraction where you're trying to divide by 0, the fraction is going to be called undefined. Okay? It's going to be called undefined because it can't happen. So when we're talking about multiplying and dividing, keep in mind you're going to multiply or divide just like you normally do. The only thing that's different is the negatives. So I've got negative 2 times negative 2. Well, the first question is, what is 2 times 2? 2 times 2 is 4. Right? Now, what happens with my negative and negative? Well, negative and negative, opposite, opposite, undoes each other, so I'm going to end up with just positive 4 is my answer. If I have negative 10 divided by 5, I'm going to do 10 over 5, I know is 2, and I have how many opposites? I only have 1, right? So I'm going to keep that opposite. If I look over here at number 3, I've got 10 times 20. 10 times negative 20. 10 times negative 20, I know 10 times 20 is 200, so that's going to be the first part of my answer. And then the question is, what happens with my sign? Well, I've only got one negative, so I'm going to keep it negative. Negative 2 divided by 2. Then, once again, 2 divided by 2 is 1. Anything divided by itself is always 1. But if I have a negative, I only have one negative, one opposite, so it's going to stay. There's nothing to cancel it out. When I hit 5, I see 0 over 5. Okay? Now, one way that I teach this in class, and if you've been in my class, you'll probably remember it. I learned this from a guy who I student taught under, and it's the dumbest way I've ever heard to help you remember it, but it works. If you have a beach ball, right, you can take a beach ball, and you can hold it over your head, and when you do, you make a giant 0 with your arms, right? You can hold the beach ball over your head. You can put 0 on top. Right? But if I go to the beach and I try to stand on the beach ball, it's not going to work very well, right? Well, if I look at number 5, I see that this integer on the bottom, 5, has 0 over his head. He can do that. It's 0. But if I look at 6, I've got 5 over 0. Now, 5 is trying to stand on 0. He's trying to stand on the beach ball. Can't do that. Undefined. Now, I gave you the mathematical reason behind why you can't divide by 0. I've also gave you the dumb little rule. Keep in mind, it's good to remember that you can't stand on a beach ball, but you have to know why that is. For number 7, I've got negative 4 times negative 9 times negative 5. Now, this is the point where I usually have students say, Mr. Copeland, you didn't teach us how to multiply 3. I say, I know, but I need you to apply what you've learned. How do you multiply numbers? You multiply one at a time. So what's negative 4 times negative 9. Negative 4 times negative 9 is positive 36. And positive 36 times 5, is that going to be a positive or negative? Well, positive and positive, it's going to be a positive. 36 times 5, let me see, I can do it off to the side. 36 times 5. 6 times 5 is 30. 15, 16, 17, 18. So I know 36 times 5 is going to give me positive 180. If I've got negative 6 times negative 2 times negative 3, same thing, break it into parts. Negative 6 times negative 2, positive 12. Positive 12 times negative 3. Positive times a negative, I've got to end up with a negative sign. 12 times 3 is 36. Okay. Last problem. 120 divided by negative 3 times negative 4. Now you might be thinking about order of operations. Don't worry about it right now. I thought about that when I made this problem, so that it'll all work out okay. I've got 120 divided by negative 3. Well, I know that 3 goes into 12 4 times, so 3 goes into 120 40 times. Positive or negative? Negative. Why is it going to be negative? Because 120 divided by negative 3, I only have one negative sign. Right? Now I take negative 40, and I multiply it times negative 4. Negative times a negative is going to give me a positive. 40 times 4 is 160. So there's your review of multiplying and dividing reals. Hope it was helpful.